This time on the Video Game Book Club, we read Replay the History of Video Games by Tristan Donovan with a foreword by Richard Garriott. Hey everyone. Replay the History of Video Games is a really fun book. It covers the history from about late 1940s all the way up until the mid 2000s. It's a little bit of an older book. It's about 8 to 10 years old, so it doesn't cover everything. And that's not really a bad thing when you have something like this, though, because it covers a lot of history. What I like is that it covers both the home console, the arcades, and also the computer market, which isn't something that you hear an awful lot about, but it's a really cool part of video game history, and it's fairly important as well. So it's not a perfect book by any means. It can kind of feel a little bit academic. I felt that it was a little bit like being back in grad school reading a textbook at some points, but it did enough for me to kind of keep me engaged and everything like that. So we start out with the 40s, 50s, and 60s. I'm just going to group all these together because it sets the stage for the later chapters. This will cover a few chapters in the book if you read it, but it's not really gonna get in. I'm not really gonna get into it too much here. It's basically scientists trying to find a way to demonstrate in a practical way for the public how a computer can be used, and sort of like, this is what we can do with a computer. Think about what we can do with like a much better computer. This is why you should fund us, or this is sort of like where technology is going. So they would program these things to do like really simple games, like just like really mathematical type games like chess, that sort of thing. And you get a lot of really fun stories about different scientists trying to basically program chess or program other games like tic-tac-toe, that sort of thing. A lot of these games didn't really survive because they weren't like recorded anywhere. We do get a little bit about Tennis for Two in here as well, which is really just a super fun story. It's told better in some other books, but essentially the Brookings Institute was like having this public day where they brought people in and they wanted to show them like, hey, this is what our computer can do. And what better way to do that than to like rig up a really simple game of just, hey, you can knock this glowing ball back and forth, and it's kind of a fun little game that you can play, and that would actually end up inspiring Pong later on, which is kind of a cool thing to get into. The book then goes into the 1970s, and this is where you see like the Magnavox Odyssey, and also the Pong consoles and the Atari 2600. And it doesn't just stop with those. It talks about like the early arcades, so Space War and computer space, and it also brings up another one that I didn't really know about. And then it goes into some of the other consoles that were brought in. So you get Fairchild Channel F, you get the RCA Studio 2, the Bally Professional Arcade, which became the Bally Astrocade. These are all really cool steps leading up to what eventually was the Atari 2600. And we also get a little bit on how Atari was bought by Warner Communications, which kind of, at least in my opinion, marked the sort of the downfall of Atari as soon as they got bought by Warner, and Warner just totally mismanaged the entire freaking company. You can kind of excuse it because it was a new industry at the time and Warner didn't really know how to handle it. But looking back at a historical perspective, Warner did every single thing wrong with that company. It could have been much bigger than it is today, but I'm just getting on my soapbox here where I really think Warner screwed them up. But it goes into a lot of those things, and it talks about how the arcade business was booming, how certain arcade distributors, I'm never going to be able to pronounce that right, distributors, would divide up the country, so you had to either create shell companies, which Atari did, to get your games into like the most markets possible, or you just sort of had to settle for the fact that you could only get into like half of the arcades or half of the businesses in a certain area of the town. Kind of a weird thing, but it's a really cool part of history that I didn't know about before I started reading this. So having set like all of that other stuff up with the home consoles and the arcades, the book then jumps into the UK computer market. They don't really touch on the US computer market that much, especially since it was kind of new at the time and it was still pretty small. The UK computer market got a lot bigger, especially early on in the early 80s, where you had a bunch of different companies getting in. And you even had the UK government funding one of them to create their own mini computer. That's something you didn't really see here in the US, and it's kind of a shame that that didn't happen. This story is told a little bit better in different books, but that's not really the purpose of Replay. Replay seems to just be laying out not really a chronological history, but just sort of like these are the key moments and these are some of the stories that go along with it. They do bring up a few things about how computers are able to play more complex games. Most of the arcades, you just had like the quick action games or racing games. You had a few sports titles, but when you got over to the computers, you could actually play like role-playing games. You could play strategy games, games that would take you much longer than just popping in a quarter, playing for however long that was. And that's something that's really unique, and at least in my personal opinion, that played out pretty well. It wasn't until like the home consoles really developed their own sort of a different brand of RPGs that you saw role-playing games come over to home consoles, kind of in the late 80s or so. And you can kind of argue that some of the adventure games are more role-playing, just the way that they are. But that's a debate for a totally different book. Anyway, it's just really cool to read about this section because the computer market just really fascinates me, especially in the early 80s and kind of in the late 70s as well. So I'm going to skip a little bit here, but it's not really too bad. We're not going to like take that much away from the actual story of this book. We move into sort of more of the computer market as well, and we talk about simulation games, and we also talk about Tetris and some of the games that are being made outside of sort of like the traditional market, at least during the 80s, of really the United States and Japan. Those were kind of the two big hubs of video games at the time. You also had the UK market as well, and also some of Europe. They weren't doing the same types of games and the same like level of games, at least in the United States and Japan. And if they were, I do apologize. The book and pretty much a lot of the other books I've read haven't really gotten into that too much. If there is one on the UK market, specifically in like the really cottage industry of creating games that they had, I would really love to read that. Replay doesn't get into it too much, but it's really kind of a cool thing to really sit back and look at. Another part that Replay gets into, as I just sort of spray shot this entire section here, they get into sort of the birth of simulation games. And these are games that I personally really enjoy. So you're talking like SimCity and also a lot of the tycoon games where you don't really have a set goal, but you'll have like a time limit that'll run out. Or if you run out of money, you just have to kind of like restart the game and try again. It's more about managing your resources as opposed to, trying to defeat an enemy or trying to, I don't know. That's really about it. Really just defeat an enemy or score more points than the other person. We then get a couple of chapters that I'm, again, just going to kind of group together because they all sort of go in the same direction. That talks a lot about CDs, 3D technology, and also multi-user dungeons, MUDs, and then MMOs, so like massive multiplayer online games, and multi-user dungeons, which were sort of like the precursor to them. Most of them were text-based, and they're pretty cool, and they kind of tell a little bit of a larger story in themselves. But first we're going to talk a little bit about CDs and sort of 3D technology. 3D technology, when I mention it here, they're specifically referring to games. So well, sorry, specifically referring to graphics. So taking it from like a 2D sprite to sort of a three-dimensional, kind of like that early polygon stage, and then to some of the more smooth polygons and smoother textures we're used to today. That was like a really groundbreaking thing, and in my personal opinion, it looks really freaking ugly when you go back to it and you watch the earlier ones. Some of those games you can go back to and you'll be fine. Others you go back and you just kind of cringe a little bit when you look at them. The earlier 2D pixel games and sort of into the mid to late 90s with the 2D pixels, those seem to like stand up more over time to me. But we don't need to get into that too much. The CD basically allowed for larger games, more data to be stored on them, and essentially bigger games than what the cartridges could hold. Essentially, to put this in the best possible way, the little Atari cartridges that you see, I think at like their biggest they got to 8 kilobytes of data, and another one that I can kind of see just off the top of my head here, the Master System had 4 megabytes of data as some of their biggest games. And then I think the biggest game outside of North America in the early 90s was Phantasy Star 2, and that was a 6 megabyte game. So the CD was able to make quite a bit larger game than just your regular cartridge did. Cartridges got better. I mean, if you look at the N64, you could get pretty big games on those, but that was really like absolute dinosaur tech at that time. You really could do so much more with a CD than you could with even the N64 cartridge, which was very, very advanced for cartridges, but as far as CDs, it was just absolutely nothing. And one fun thing it brings, I can't remember if they brought it up here or if I just, no, I definitely saw it other places, but NEC with their TurboGrafx CD was the first CD-based game, like first CD-based console / add-on to come out. Then the Sega Saturn came out with theirs, and then eventually it went into the PlayStation. There are also some others in between, but those consoles kind of died out pretty quick. It's still like a pretty big landmark to see like those types of games come out. They're pretty fun to go back if you have a Sega CD, or if you have the ability to play some of those, you'll find they're really, really good. They're honestly, if you look back at like 1992, they're miles ahead of anything at that point. Especially if you look at, I believe it's the Street Fighter 2 version that's on the TurboGrafx. That's running on an 8-bit system, and it looks really amazing. It looks better than, I think it's pretty close to like the PlayStation version. It's so amazing what they could pull off with that thing. But then they jump ahead, sorry. I went off on a bit of a tangent, sorry about that. We then go into, from the CDs, it transitions into multi-user dungeons and massive multiplayer online games. Now, it's important to kind of link these two because having that CD allowed you to get bigger games, which led into the massive multiplayer online. And the multi-user dungeons sort of showed that you could do like a large game across like a network of computers, and that sort of added on and the MMOs were built sort of from that, because you could do, okay, well, if we could do this with a text, why can't we do this with graphics? And that's kind of what happened with that. Now they bring up this really cool thing, which I had no idea was actually something that happened. South Korea had banned imports from Japan, obviously because of the way that they were treated under Japanese occupation. But I didn't know that they, in order to get their video game industry going, they were essentially pirating video games from Japan and from other parts of the world. And so in order to get the South Koreans to play like basically computer games, they had to convince them to do it. So they had their own string of, like a long string of massive multiplayer online games. And so that's kind of how they got in there, because they couldn't convince South Koreans to pay for a game when they were so used to pirating them or paying like a very low cost. So these massive multiplayer online games, which basically charge you a subscription, that was more appealing to them than playing something else. You know, basically buying a $50 game, it was easier to buy one and then just, okay, we're just going to pay a subscription fee. I'm sure I totally mangled all of that for you, and I apologize. But it's just such a cool story. I don't really think I did that part justice. At least, definitely read up on that because that's a really cool story. So like I said, the book it's a history book, so for like a casual reader, you might not want to just sit down and crack this one open. This might be something that if you're doing a research project or something like that, you might thumb through this to find some information. If you're crazy like me, then yeah, you might sit down and want to read through the whole thing. I did have flashbacks of being in grad school though, where I'm like, okay, I can speed read this chapter and just try to pull out like the bullet points and everything like that. And in doing so, I kind of felt like I was missing a few things, but I tried to fit as much as I could into this. There's still more stories in here, a lot of really fun stuff that if you're just interested in the video game history overall, you'll find some cool things in here that you might not have known, just because of how much this book actually covers. It is an older book, you should be able to find it a little bit cheaper. That's what I did, I just got a used copy. Anyway, guys, if you have any questions or comments, or wondering why the hell I sat down and read this entire thing, just let me know in the comments below. I do have a book for next time. I will be reading Lost in a Good Game by Peter Eccles. I don't really know yet. I haven't started reading, so I'm looking forward to it. Not sure when I'll be able to get it done, because I'm just kind of a little bit busy right now. Anyway, I will talk to you all later, and have a great day.